Hello, my friends. As you can tell from the title of this video, I'm about to share a controversial and probably unpopular opinion. In explaining this position, I expect that I will be spoiling a good deal of both JoJo's Bizarre Adventure as well as Persona 5. With that said, you're on notice. Today I want to talk about storytelling structure and how that affects writing. First, let's talk briefly on what storytelling structure is. Whenever a person sets out to tell a narrative, that story, necessarily, will be broken down into a number of different parts, each with their own goals for what the author wants the reader to experience. For example, any given story is going to have a beginning, middle, and end. The beginning will introduce the characters and establish the setting. The middle will establish the conflicts of the story as it leads up to and resolves the climax, or the greatest conflict, while the end gives closure to the aftermath of the conflict by describing how characters and the setting have changed as a result of those conflicts. Obviously, this is just one basic example of how to write a 3-act story, but it is important to establish these basics to understand that what narrative structure you choose is in fact going to affect how you end up writing the story. To demonstrate this, let's look at a few other narrative structures and the effects that they have on writing. The 5-act story, the framing device, and in media res. The 5-act story is essentially the same as the 3-act structure, only more specified and more patient. The 5 acts are exposition, rising action, climax, falling action, and resolution. Exposition is essentially the same as the 3-act structure. The rising action has all the minor conflicts and character building. The falling action is characters reacting to the climax, and the resolution is also unchanged from the 3-act structure. The main difference for the 5-act structure is in how the author approaches the climax. When you think of the climax as its own separate part of the story, the author naturally spends more time exploring the dynamics and effects of the story's major conflict. For example, once the major conflict of a story is introduced, you can spend time having characters fight amongst themselves as to how to solve that conflict, or struggle with the need to ignore minor conflicts, which they wouldn't have ignored during the rising action. When the climax is thought of as a separate act, it enables unique rising and falling actions within the climax. In the standard 3-act structure, the climax is a single pivotal moment that demands immediate resolution, and thus no time for introspective conflict by the characters. The framing device is a way of changing story structure that allows for a smooth entry and exit from the events of a story. It begins with an exposition of the situation of the storyteller and gives the author a good excuse to simply dump the actual story's exposition in a way that would normally be considered forced or stiff. If you are telling an episodic story, the framing device allows you to interrupt the story or insert a temporary resolution in the middle of the main story structure, in a way that is expected and thus not jarring or unimmersive. The main strength of the framing device, however, is that it creates the potential for a strong and detailed final act or resolution. The characters are given permission by the framing device to reflect on the nuances of solving the major conflict at the time, and the audience is shown the long-term effects of the events of the story. The framing device allows you to shrink the length of the beginning and replace it with far more time devoted to the conclusion. In media res is a story structure that starts you in the middle of the major conflict of the story, or just slightly before that conflict, and then immediately jumps back to the beginning of the story to start the exposition. The major benefit is that the sudden and immediate action scenes, the danger and the risk of the climax, gets the audience to have an immediate reaction, and that is supposed to hook the audience, get them invested. But after that, you have to return to a more standard narrative structure. While that hook is a big benefit, it also has a big drawback. Once you have pumped up the audience's endorphins and put all of their interest in that thing that will happen later, the audience must now wait through an exposition that is, by comparison, slow and boring. The audience is now more invested in the event, the conflict, rather than the character's reaction or context in that conflict. Authors naturally react to this by rushing through the exposition, and thus the exposition becomes flimsy and largely unimportant. And this brings me to the story structure that I really want to talk about. Japan's 4-act story structure: exposition, rising action, twist, and the final climax/conclusion act. To talk about it, we need to get on the same page about what a twist is. A twist is a narrative device that is typically used to establish the climax of a story. Most often in crime or mystery stories, a twist is meant to amaze the audience at the highest moment of tension. As we have seen with all of these different story structures, the main change that happens with any given conception is the amount of time and detail the author gives to that section of the story. Given that it is a recent example, I will turn to Persona 5. Persona 5 has a mixture of almost all of these story structures at once. It begins in media res as you jump through an expensive-looking casino and end up getting captured by the enemy. Rather than jumping immediately to the story, instead Persona 5 then jumps to the story's framing device, an interrogation with the character Sae Nijima, a public prosecutor, owner of the judge confidant, and the older sister of Persona 5's best waifu, Makoto Nijima. The major spoiler for Persona 5 in here is that it turns out the casino at the beginning was Sae Nijima's palace, a symbol of her corruption, and because of how realistic Sae Nijima's mental world delusions were, the police were conveniently able to enter the distorted metaverse, arrest you, and imprison you back in the real world without narrative dissonance. We then catch up to the in media res interrogation after countless jumps back to that interrogation that happened at the beginning, middle, and end of each chapter. At this point, the player is issued a pivotal dialogue choice. Sae Nijima asks something along the lines of, quote, "Are you sure you worked alone?" Then, a little butterfly girl warns you about the choice and tells you to trust in the bonds you formed. Here, I'm going to point out what I believe to be a flaw in how we finish out the rising action with this question. Throughout the game, not only do we build confidants with our teammates, but we are building a confidant with our interrogator in the future. The butterfly voice tells you to trust in your bonds and answer the question. So essentially you are given two options between the three dialogue choices. Do you trust in your teammates, lie, and say you worked alone? Or do you trust in your bond with Sae Nijima and tell the truth? Ignoring the fact that trusting your teammates could equally motivate you to tell the truth and trust in their ability to not be caught, if you go with the truth, your character thinks, quote, "I think I'm forgetting something," end quote. At which point Sae Nijima leaves, Goro Akechi walks in and shoots you in the head, you die, game over. If you lie, not trusting in Sae Nijima, your character tells Sae Nijima to show Goro Akechi his phone, and then you ask her to trust in you, and then you trust her to show that phone to Goro Akechi. In other words, if you trust in her at this sentence, you get shot in the head. If you trust in her after delivering the vital information, literally one sentence later, you succeed at your master plan and we officially enter the twist act of the game. In the twist act, we sit through a lot of flashbacks that occurred during the game that exposed Akechi as having access to the metaverse before he revealed that information himself. Some extra scenes using the flashback filter that were not in the game previously are also thrown in to explain what that information meant. Then there is another flashback scene that was not in the game previously, where Futaba explains that she can make a program that will automatically bring Akechi into the metaverse, but she needs to do it manually. Finally, they show the scene where Futaba grabs Akechi's phone to do that. Now that we are on the same page as to what happened, let's talk about the problem with this twist. The problem is, this isn't a twist. A twist is when an author purposefully gives you all of the information needed to predict the result, but presents it as mundane and non-impactful. Persona 5 literally just didn't tell you what your own character's plan was. They gave a reason for why you couldn't remember, mainly that you were drugged by the police, but literally by answering a question completely unrelated to the plan, Joker is able to remember the plan without telling the player, despite the drugs that were keeping him from remembering in a way that would actually tell the player what the player's plan is. So what exactly was revealed in this twist? From the very first clue we got, Morgana was literally telling us to be suspicious of Goro Akechi. We spend the whole game thinking that he is a two-faced bad guy. He reveals that he is a persona user that can do both bless and curse elements, wow, just like a two-faced bad guy, and then the two-faced suspicious guy revealed himself to be a bad guy. Wow, the guy who was a bad guy the whole game turned out to be a bad guy. That's not a twist, that's not surprising at all. And then lastly, the big, super amazing twist that the game has is that, surprise boys and girls, it turns out that the characters knew that the suspicious bad guy was a persona user a few days earlier than when the game told you, and they made a plan that we didn't tell you about so that we could have this big twist reveal act. That isn't a twist. You just didn't tell me what the story was, and then you spent a long time explaining what the story was as though you were explaining a twist through flashbacks. Having information revealed to you that you already had revealed to you very literally and very directly, only to be told, well, your character actually knew that a few days earlier than you did. There's no surprise. There's no awe. I already knew that. So let me cut to the chase and explain my point on this. Japan's 4-act story arc makes authors think of the twist, which is inherently a narrative device designed to be momentary, to be the peak at the height of a climax, as though it were a whole and separate narrative event. So the authors write a whole and separate narrative event that they just hide from the viewer. This kind of twist is just a part of a normal rising action. The events in Persona 5 could remain literally unchanged after this point if Sae Nijima's palace ended instead with holding the whole interrogation in Sae Nijima's cognition, having Goro Akechi betray and try to kill us, and we slyly switch with Sae Nijima's cognition of Joker. Goro kills the cognition. Same story happens from there. No hidden story from the player, no change to the events afterward. Bad guys think that we're dead, school uses the same vacation excuse, and we can still get the big oh shit fight at the end of Shido's palace when Akechi confronts us. Thinking of a twist as a whole and separate act results in the twist being written in so much detail and time that it stops being a twist at all. Now don't get me twisted here, because I still loved Persona 5, enough to make 3 other full analysis videos on it, and the ending in particular was one of my favorites this year. In fact, the major strength of the 4-act story structure is that it encourages a detailed and patient ending by treating the climax as part of the resolution. But if you'll humor me for a little longer, I want to describe a use of the twist that is simultaneously a critique of and perfection of Japan's 4-act story structure, JoJo's Bizarre Adventure. JoJo's Bizarre Adventure is a beautifully complex show that is delivered in an extremely simple package. The story is semi-episodic, but almost always follows a simple 3-act structure. The main difference is that every act is painted with a new twist happening every few minutes. These twists start as MacGuffin superpowers like hormone breathing and quickly evolve in making the twist out of a creative use of the limits of the superpower, as it was already explained. JoJo grows this by making those twists themselves evolve, as evidenced in Part 2, Battle Tendency. when Joseph Joestar's secret technique of running away literally becomes the main way to defeat the final enemy, and doing an even greater version of combining both the original creative expansion of MacGuffins with story-spanning twists, when in Part 4, Diamond is Unbreakable, Koichi's stand literally has the power of unlimited evolutionary potential established early on that becomes a new MacGuffin whenever Koichi is in danger. Greater than any of that, however, is in the final fight of Part 4, where Josuke is fighting Kira. Rather than trying to escalate the conflict by showing each twist one after the other, they keep the camera on the characters and show Josuke and Kira go through the motions of setting up those moments which were considered twists in earlier episodes. And the excitement comes not from the surprise, but from whether or not the surprise plan will work. And above all, told the audience the twist was coming in a way that still delivered on the hype and the awe that a twist is meant to create. In other words, they told us the plan and still achieved the dramatic tension of a twist by pairing these twist conventions against each other. The reason being is because JoJo took Japan's 4-act storytelling structure, removed it from the line, and expanded the twist act over every single act of the story. Rather than a story that has a twist, twisting is the story itself. Really, this is the ultimate version of what the 4-act structure aims at. JoJo's narrative is the virtue of the 4-act story. Since I have gotten to experience the epitome of this thing, I just don't have the patience to stomach lazy versions of the 4-act story like what I saw in Persona 5. Persona 5 is still one of the best games ever, but I expected better. Thank you for watching, everyone. If you enjoyed this video, even with all of the controversy and the opinions that probably have you very angry at me right now, subscribe to the channel and share with your friends, because I don't pay anyone to advertise this channel for me. The only way we can grow is with your help. And as always, stay true.